Eduardo and Esperanza Morales had survived 53 years of marriage, raised 3 children, and believed family meant something. They were wrong. The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a grandson who couldn't meet their eyes. No warning, no conversation, just cold paperwork that erased decades of love in a single sentence. Their son Roberto owned the house now, the same house they'd paid for with sweat and sacrifice, and he wanted them gone. His voice on the phone was clinical, detached. "It's just business, Dad. Property values are high. There's a nursing home across town with reasonable rates." Reasonable for who? Not for 2 people living on pension checks that barely covered food. Eduardo was 74, his hands gnarled from 42 years of carpentry. Esperanza was 72, her back aching from 35 years as a nurse. They'd given everything to their children, and this was their reward. 3 days to pack their lives into Eduardo's rusted pickup truck. 3 days before they became invisible, they loaded what they could. Wedding rings, faded photographs, a handful of clothes that still fit bodies shaped by time and hardship. And Canella, their 10-year-old golden retriever whose grey-flecked fur matched the exhaustion in her eyes. The dog seemed to understand. She stayed close, alert, as they spent 3 nights sleeping in the truck cab, Eduardo's spine screaming against the cramped space, while Esperanza tried to make beds from old blankets in the pickup bed. They were homeless, discarded, forgotten by the children they'd sacrificed everything to raise. Valle Verde appeared on their 3rd day of wandering like a mirage built from desperation. 6 blocks of faded storefronts, half of them empty with sun-bleached signs advertising businesses that died years ago. A diner called El Rincón de Carmen, a grocery store with produce that had seen better days, a barbershop pole that hadn't spun in decades. This was the kind of place where 2 old people and their dog could disappear without anyone caring enough to ask questions. The cabin sat on the town's edge, where pavement surrendered to gravel and hope gave way to despair. Eduardo spotted it first. The structure sagged like the shoulders of an exhausted old man. Boards hung loose from the walls like broken teeth. Windows gaped empty, their glass long surrendered to storms and stones. Weeds pushed through foundation cracks that spoke of years without maintenance. It looked like the physical manifestation of how they felt inside, broken, abandoned, worthless. But Eduardo had spent 4 decades seeing past surface problems to the potential underneath. He pulled the truck over. Canella jumped from the cab with surprising energy, her nose immediately investigating smells that told stories of abandonment and possibility. She circled the building twice before sitting at what might have once been a front door, her tail wagging with the first enthusiasm she'd shown in days. Eduardo walked the perimeter slowly, his carpenter's eye seeing beyond the decay to the bones underneath. The foundation was solid fieldstone, built to last by someone who understood that good work endures. The structure was heavy oak, wood that had withstood decades without surrendering its integrity. The roofline was straight despite the sagging shingles, suggesting the frame could be saved with proper attention. "Bones are good, Esperancita," he said, running his hands along the exterior walls. "Really good. Someone built this place to last." That afternoon they explored. Eduardo took mental notes about repairs while Esperanza assessed the space for livability. The interior was larger than it appeared from outside. 2 rooms that could serve as bedroom and living area. Space that could become a kitchen with proper plumbing. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney intact and promising warmth during the cold months ahead. When evening approached, they camped in the truck one more time. But for the first time in days, they slept with something resembling hope. Canella curled between them, her presence a reminder that family comes in many forms, and sometimes the most loyal love comes from the most unexpected sources. Tomorrow, Eduardo decided, they would begin the work of building a home from the bones of someone else's abandoned dream. They found the box on their 2nd day, a loose floorboard in the far corner that didn't sit quite flush against the others. Canella noticed it first, sniffing around the board with unusual interest. Eduardo knelt carefully, his arthritic knees protesting, and worked the board loose with his fingers. Underneath was a small cavity, and nestled inside was a wooden box the size of a shoebox. Its surface was dusty but intact. Esperanza lifted it carefully, feeling its weight. Someone had hidden this here. The box wasn't locked, just secured with a simple wooden latch that had swollen with moisture over time. Eduardo freed it, and Esperanza opened the lid to reveal a collection of papers, photographs, and letters tied with faded ribbon. The first photograph showed a man and woman standing in front of the cabin, but the cabin in the image looked completely different. The roof was straight and new, the walls freshly painted white with green trim. A garden bloomed beside the front steps, and the couple smiled with the satisfaction of people who had built something with their own hands. Santiago and Rosa Herrera, Esperanza read from the back of the photograph. 1987. The letters were addressed to Santiago Herrera, and as Esperanza read them aloud, a story began to emerge. Santiago had been a veteran, like Eduardo, who had come to Valle Verde seeking peace after years of war. Rosa had been a teacher who believed home was something you created, not something you inherited. Together they had taken this abandoned structure and transformed it into their sanctuary. But life had other plans. The letters spoke of Rosa's illness, of medical bills that consumed their savings, of Santiago's struggle to care for his wife while maintaining their home. The final letter, dated just 3 years ago, was from a social worker explaining that Santiago had been moved to a care facility in the county seat, and the property had reverted to the town for unpaid taxes. He wanted to come back, Esperanza said softly, reading the last letter Santiago had written to a friend. He kept saying the house was waiting for him, that he and Rosa had put too much love into it to just let it die. Eduardo found himself looking around the interior with new eyes. These walls had sheltered love. They had been shaped by hope. They had known the touch of hands that cared about more than just function. The water stains and loose boards weren't signs of failure. They were evidence of a battle fought with dignity, even in defeat. That night they slept inside the cabin for the first time, using their sleeping bags on the wooden floor near the fireplace. The walls creaked with settling wood and the whisper of wind through empty window frames. But somehow it felt safer than the truck, more like a place where dreams might take root again. Before falling asleep, Esperanza carefully returned the letters and photographs to their wooden box, but left it where they could see it from their makeshift bed. Santiago and Rosa Herrera had become their partners in this endeavor, their spirits woven into the foundations of what this place would become. Eduardo's red metal toolbox sat in the back of his pickup, like an old friend waiting to be useful again. He'd carried it from job site to job site for over 4 decades, adding tools as his skills grew, and his understanding of wood and stone deepened. The box itself was dented and scarred, its paint worn where his hands had gripped it thousands of times, but every tool inside was clean, sharp, and ready to work. First things first, he told Esperanza as he lifted the toolbox from the truck bed. We need to make this place weatherproof before the next storm hits. The roof demanded immediate attention. Eduardo climbed carefully onto the sagging structure, his 74-year-old body protesting each step up the improvised ladder he'd built from scrap wood found behind the cabin. From above he could see the full extent of the damage. Several rafters had cracked under the weight of accumulated snow and ice, and the entire east section needed new support before winter arrived. He worked methodically, his movements economical from decades of practice. Esperanza helped from below, passing him materials before he asked for them, steadying the ladder when he descended, contributing the efficiency of 53 years of partnership. Canella supervised with the serious expression of a dog who understood that important decisions were being made. By afternoon, they had covered the worst openings. The patches weren't pretty, but they would keep out rain and provide insulation against the cooling nights. Eduardo stood back to admire their work, his hands black with grime and his shirt soaked with sweat, but his expression contained satisfaction he hadn't felt in years. "It's not much," he said, "but it's a start." Valle Verde had exactly one grocery store that could provide supplies. Mercado Morales occupied a corner building on Main Street, its windows displaying handwritten signs for specials that changed weekly based on what the distributor could deliver to a town most companies had written off as unprofitable. Esperanza walked the 6 blocks from the cabin with Canella at her side, carrying a canvas bag that once had contained Eduardo's work clothes and now served as her shopping basket. The morning air was cool with the promise of autumn, and Esperanza tried to project confidence she didn't completely feel as she approached the store's glass doors. The bell above the entrance announced her arrival, and conversation stopped. 3 customers turned to stare at the unfamiliar woman with the golden retriever, their expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. Behind the counter, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and suspicious eyes watched her approach. "What can I help you with?" he asked, his tone suggesting that helping her was the last thing he wanted to do. Esperanza moved through the narrow aisles, acutely aware of the whispered conversations following her progress. The selection was limited but adequate. She chose carefully, calculating prices in her head and selecting items that would stretch their remaining money as far as possible. At checkout, the man rang up her purchases with mechanical efficiency while casting furtive glances at Canella, who sat patiently beside Esperanza with the disciplined posture of a dog trained for public behavior. "Haven't seen you around before?" he said, while bagging her groceries. "We just moved to town," Esperanza replied. "Oh, we're fixing up the old place on the outskirts." The man's expression changed to something between surprise and concern. "You're talking about the Herrera place, that old cabin?" The woman in line behind Esperanza moved closer, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. "Nobody's lived there for years. The place is falling apart." Esperanza felt heat rising to her cheeks at the implicit suggestion that people their age had no business attempting such a project. She paid for her groceries and left quickly, Canella trotting beside her with the awareness that they were no longer welcome in that particular space. But Valle Verde's suspicion began to thaw as Eduardo's skills became visible. Tomas Bravo, who ran the hardware store, stopped one afternoon to examine Eduardo's work. He walked around the building slowly, running his hands over the new siding and checking the alignment of Eduardo's repairs. "You know what you're doing?" Tomas said finally. "This is quality work." Eduardo felt a spark of possibility. "What kind of materials?" "Whatever you need for this place, within reason, of course." The arrangement proved mutually beneficial. Eduardo spent mornings working on the cabin and afternoons helping Tomas with repairs that had been postponed too long. In exchange, he received not just cash, but also access to lumber, hardware, and tools that would have been far beyond their budget. Esperanza, meanwhile, had begun providing informal medical care to neighbors who learned of her nursing experience. Senora Patino, who lived 3 blocks away, had been struggling with wound care after minor surgery. The town doctor only visited twice a week, and the nearest hospital was 40 miles away in the county seat. Esperanza cleaned and dressed Senora Patino's surgical site with the gentle competence that had defined her career, while Canella provided what amounted to therapy dog services, allowing Senora Patino to pet her soft fur while Esperanza worked. Word spread quietly through Valle Verde about the elderly couple who were proving more capable than anyone had expected. Carmen Valdez appeared at their gate on a Thursday morning, carrying a covered dish and walking with the careful gait of someone who had learned to accommodate a body that no longer obeyed without question. She was maybe 70, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that contained both weariness and kindness in equal measure. Canella noticed her first, lifting her head from where she'd been napping in a patch of morning sun. Instead of barking, she wagged her tail and headed toward the gate with the welcoming attitude of a dog who sensed no threat. "Excuse me," the woman called softly. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Carmen introduced herself as Santiago Herrera's younger sister. She had helped him and Rosa fix up the cabin 30 years ago. The connection Eduardo and Esperanza had felt with the previous owners suddenly became personal, immediate. "I've been keeping this for him," Carmen said, unwrapping tissue paper to reveal a hand-carved wooden walking stick, its surface polished smooth by years of use. The handle was shaped like a bird's head, and intricate patterns spiraled down its length. Santiago carved this himself after his war injury made walking difficult. Eduardo felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Carmen explained that Santiago had died the previous winter in the Millfield Care Facility, never stopping his talk about returning home. "I think he'd be pleased to know that people who understand the value of building something with their own hands are living in the home he and Rosa created," Carmen said, placing the walking stick against the mantel where it seemed to belong. Before leaving, Carmen walked the perimeter of the property with Eduardo, pointing out where Santiago had planted fruit trees and where Rosa had maintained her vegetable garden. She promised to return with more stories and whatever help she could provide. That afternoon, Eduardo leaned Santiago's walking stick against the wall beside their sleeping bags, where moonlight would catch the carved patterns and cast intricate shadows on the wooden floor. It joined Eduardo's bronze star as symbols of the different forms of courage that had shaped their lives. The black sedan pulled up to their gate on a Tuesday morning in November, its polished surface reflecting the autumn sun like a dark mirror. Eduardo was splitting firewood for the approaching winter when the car doors closed with the authority of people accustomed to being taken seriously. Two men in expensive suits approached, their shoes inadequate for the gravel path Eduardo had laid between the gate and the house. Canella growled low in her throat, a sound Eduardo had never heard from her before. She positioned herself between the strangers and the front door, her hackles raised with instinctive caution. "Señor Morales," the taller man consulted a tablet as he spoke. "I'm Ricardo Piedra from Piedra Development Corporation. This is my associate, Señor Jimenez. We need to discuss your occupation of this property." Eduardo set down his axe slowly, his military training automatically assessing the men's posture and intentions. "What kind of discussion?" "The kind involving legal ownership," Piedra responded, producing a thick manila folder of documents. "This property has been purchased by our company for development purposes. You and your wife are trespassing. The documents appeared legitimate. Deeds, tax assessments, transfer paperwork bearing official seals and signatures." Piedra explained that Piedra Development Corporation specialized in vacation rentals for urban professionals seeking authentic rural experiences. This location was perfect for their purposes once they removed the existing structure and built appropriate facilities. Eduardo felt something cold settle in his chest. "Remove the structure?" Piedra nodded. "Yes, demolish it. The foundation is adequate for new construction, but the existing building has no value for our development plans." They had 30 days to vacate. Piedra preferred they leave sooner if possible, as there was significant financial incentive for early completion. Carmen arrived the next morning carrying a leather briefcase that had belonged to her late husband, a man who had spent 40 years as Valle Verde's only attorney before his death 5 years ago. Her expression contained the determined look of someone who had spent a sleepless night making difficult decisions. "I need to show you something," she said, settling at Esperanza's kitchen table while Eduardo poured coffee into the mismatched mugs that had become their daily ritual. "Something Santiago left with me for safekeeping in case this day ever came." She opened the briefcase and withdrew a document wrapped in protective plastic. Its edges yellowed with age, but its text still clearly legible. It was an original property deed dated 15 years earlier. Carmen explained that Santiago had legally claimed the property through adverse possession laws. In Mexico, if you occupy and improve abandoned property for 15 years, maintain it openly and continuously, and pay any back taxes, you can claim legal ownership. According to Santiago's will, which Carmen's husband had helped draft, the property was supposed to transfer to whoever needed it most when Santiago could no longer care for it. The town never had the right to sell the property for back taxes because Santiago was current on all payments until the day he entered care. Walter Morrison arrived from Florida driving a battered Buick that looked almost as old as he did, but his handshake was firm and his eyes contained the sharp intelligence of a man who had spent 50 years outmaneuvering opponents who underestimated him. He stood barely 5'6", with snow-white hair and a rumpled suit that had seen better decades. But when he spoke about property law, his voice carried absolute authority. "The first thing we need to do," he said, spreading documents across Esperanza's kitchen table, "is document community support for your presence here. Courts pay attention when local residents demonstrate investment in a case's outcome." Tomas Bravo had been their first visitor that morning, arriving with a clipboard and a determined expression. He signed Walter's petition with bold, decisive strokes. Senora Patiño arrived next, walking slowly but firmly with the cane Eduardo had repaired for her. She'd brought 3 neighbors who had benefited from Esperanza's nursing care, each eager to add their names to the growing list of supporters. By noon, 23 residents had signed, including the Methodist minister, the mailman, and the woman who ran the town's only cafe. Each signature represented more than support. It represented recognition that Eduardo and Esperanza had become integral to Valle Verde's fabric. The court hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. The courtroom was smaller than Esperanza had expected, with wooden benches that reminded her of church pews and tall windows that let in morning light, but offered no view of the outside world. Judge Patricia Chen presided from behind a mahogany bench that elevated her above the proceedings with appropriate authority, her expression neutral but attentive as attorneys presented opening arguments. Piedra Development Corporation had brought 3 lawyers, each carrying briefcases that suggested unlimited resources and absolute confidence in their position. Walter Morrison stood to respond, his rumpled appearance contrasting sharply with the corporate attorney's polished presentation. But when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of 5 decades spent defending people who couldn't defend themselves. He produced the documents Carmen had preserved for 15 years, proving Santiago Herrera's legal ownership through proper adverse possession claim, and his will transferring the property to Eduardo and Esperanza. Walter then revealed the anonymous photographs documenting Piedra Development Corporation's pattern of targeting elderly residents, acquiring properties through questionable tax sales, and then suing residents for the value of improvements made to property the company claimed to own. 8 similar cases in the past 3 years, always attacking elderly residents, always claiming property was abandoned despite evidence of occupation and improvement. Judge Chen studied the photographs with visible disgust, her expression hardening as she recognized the pattern Walter was revealing. When she raised the gavel, Esperanza held her breath, knowing the next words would determine whether they would return home to continue building their life together or begin the heartbreaking process of abandoning everything they had created. The wooden gavel came down with the finality of justice served and the promise of protection for those who needed it most. In the matter of Piedra Development Corporation versus Eduardo and Esperanza Morales, Judge Chen announced, her voice carrying the weight of legal authority, this court finds that the defendants are the rightful owners of the property in question. 6 months after their court victory, Eduardo stood on his front porch watching sunrise paint the sky over Valle Verde in shades of gold and rose. The transformation was visible in every direction. Their cottage, he'd stopped thinking of it as a cabin months ago, now sported fresh white paint with green trim matching the original colors from Santiago and Rosa's photograph. Window boxes filled with Esperanza's flowers brightened the facade, and a proper front porch with railings and steps provided a welcoming entrance for the steady stream of visitors who had become part of their daily routine. Inside, Esperanza was preparing breakfast on the propane stove Eduardo had installed to complement the fireplace cooking that had sustained them through their first difficult months. The small kitchen now had proper countertops, a sink connected to the well Eduardo had repaired, and cabinets he'd built to Esperanza's specifications. Canella paced through the morning routine with the satisfaction of a dog whose world had stabilized into predictable patterns of comfort and security. Eduardo's reputation as a craftsman had grown beyond Tomas Bravo's loading dock repairs. He now had a waiting list of clients seeking his services for projects ranging from kitchen renovations to custom furniture. Esperanza had established herself as Valle Verde's unofficial community health assistant, providing nursing care that filled the gap between residents' needs and the limited medical services available in their rural area. Their success had attracted attention. Beyond Valle Verde, the investigative article about Piedra, Development Corporation's predatory practices had generated inquiries from other elderly residents facing similar threats, and Walter Morrison had begun coordinating a network of pro bono lawyers willing to take such cases. 3 elderly couples had contacted Esperanza directly, seeking advice about reclaiming abandoned properties in small towns where housing costs exceeded fixed incomes. Eduardo had begun teaching basic carpentry skills to younger residents eager to learn traditional building techniques. Students from the local high school volunteered to help with construction as part of a vocational training program that taught practical carpentry skills while contributing to community welfare. The blueprints spread across Eduardo's workbench were drawn on graph paper with the precision of someone who understood that small homes required careful planning to maximize both function and comfort. Each line represented months of thought about how elderly people could live with dignity when traditional housing had become unaffordable, and how communities could support residents who brought skills and wisdom instead of burden and expense. 6 small cottages could be built for approximately what Piedra Development Corporation had planned to spend on a single vacation rental unit, and they would serve people who needed housing instead of wealthy tourists seeking authentic rural experiences. The land for the project had been donated by Valle Verde itself, a 10-acre parcel behind the elementary school that had been designated for commercial development but had never attracted suitable businesses. The town council had voted unanimously to rezone the property for affordable senior housing, recognizing that Eduardo and Esperanza's success had demonstrated the value of supporting elderly residents instead of pushing them toward distant care facilities. Carmen had been instrumental in organizing community support for the project, coordinating with local churches, service organizations, and businesses to provide materials, labor, and financial contributions. The photograph sat in a place of honor on Esperanza's mantle, nestled between Santiago's carved walking stick and Eduardo's bronze star, like a bridge connecting past struggles with present satisfaction. It showed 7 people arranged in front of their cottage on a perfect autumn afternoon. Eduardo and Esperanza in the center, Carmen beside them with her arm around Esperanza's shoulders, Walter Morrison visiting from Florida, Tomas Bravo and Senora Patiño representing the community that had embraced them, and Canella sitting proudly at Eduardo's feet with the dignified expression of a dog who knew she belonged exactly where she was. Behind them, the cottage gleamed in afternoon sunlight, its white walls and green trim a testament to what love and determination could accomplish when given the chance to flourish. The small garden visible in the background showed vegetables that would carry them through winter, and the neat stacks of firewood beside the front porch promised warmth during the cold months ahead. The photograph had been taken by Roberto during his first visit to Valle Verde, 3 months after his letter of apology had opened the door to careful reconciliation. Their grandchildren had spent a weekend learning to split firewood under Eduardo's patient instruction, and helping Esperanza harvest vegetables from the garden that had become a neighborhood treasure. Reconciliation with Roberto and his family had proceeded slowly, built on acknowledgement of past mistakes instead of attempts to pretend they hadn't occurred. Eduardo and Esperanza had established boundaries that protected their independence while allowing space for their children and grandchildren to demonstrate growth and understanding through actions instead of words. Carmen had effectively become the daughter they deserved, stopping by most afternoons to share coffee and conversation, contributing vegetables from her garden and providing the kind of daily companionship that made aging feel like a privilege instead of a burden. The first residents had moved into the affordable senior cottages the previous month. A retired teacher whose pension couldn't cover rising apartment costs, and a veteran whose disability benefits fell short of market-rate housing. Both had brought skills that strengthened the community. The teacher had begun tutoring local children, and the veteran had started a small engine repair service that served farmers throughout the county. Canella had aged gracefully during their year and a half in Valle Verde, her golden coat now more silver than gold, but her enthusiasm for daily routines unchanged. She greeted each morning with tail-wagging optimism, supervised Eduardo's ongoing improvement projects with professional interest, and provided comfort to Esperanza's patients with the intuitive compassion that had made her an unofficial therapy dog. As afternoons settled over Valle Verde, Eduardo and Esperanza sat on their newly built front porch, sharing a dinner of Esperanza's potato soup and bread she'd baked in the fireplace oven. Canella lay at their feet, contentedly chewing a bone Tomas Bravo had brought from his own dog supplies. The view included the rising walls of Carmen's cottage, the completed senior housing units where their neighbors lived with dignity and purpose, and the small workshop where Eduardo spent his days creating furniture that would outlast the people who used it. "Do you ever miss the old life?" Esperanza asked, the question prompted by a letter from one of their former neighbors who had written to say the house on Los Alamos Street had been sold again, this time to young professionals who commuted to city jobs. Eduardo considered the question while watching Canella investigate something interesting in the garden they'd built together. "I miss the illusion that someone else was responsible for taking care of us," he said finally. "But I don't miss the helplessness that came with that illusion." Esperanza nodded, understanding that their journey from abandonment to belonging had taught them lessons about dignity and self-worth that couldn't be learned any other way. They had discovered that home was something you created through love and work. That family included everyone who chose to stand with you during difficult times, and that age brought wisdom and capability instead of inevitable decline. The photograph on the mantel captured more than a moment in time. It documented the transformation of two people who had been discarded as burdens into community leaders who proved that every person deserves the opportunity to contribute their gifts to the world around them. They had defended more than just their own right to shelter. They had proved that dignity and determination could triumph over exploitation and greed, and they had done it with the support of a community that had learned to value their contributions over their age or circumstances. What began as an ending became their greatest beginning.